Definition of ready. Today, one thing I want to discuss with you is definition of ready. What is definition of ready? What does it mean, and how do we apply definition of ready? In this video, first I will talk through what definition of ready is, explain the theory behind it. I will talk through what the invest in user story is and what the 3 C's mean. At the end of the video, I will talk through how I implement definition of ready in my team. What is definition of ready? Definition of ready to me is the agreement created by the team. It defines the requirements that must be met before we commit to any user story in the sprint. It helps us identify blockers and dependencies upfront before we commit to stories in the sprint. Out of this, there might be things like Spike we need to do before we can commit a user story to a sprint. So it helps us identify those blockers, those dependencies, those things that are going to slow us down in a sprint, during a sprint, to be honest with you, and help them resolve them earlier on, so that when we are in sprint, we are in full flow. We are actually sprinting and meeting our sprint goals. Also, what I find that when we have definition of ready, it encourages team to use the best practices when creating user stories. So they will look at what invest model is, what 3 C's is, and implement that when they're writing the user stories. So it's generally a good practice. There are some downsides to it, but majority of the teams, they find the structure of definition of ready beneficial and they enjoy that. What do you normally find defined in definition of ready? So normally in definition of ready, it will have things like that a user story must have been through a 3 Amigo sessions. A user story must have been through a refinement session, and all of the external dependencies are mapped out. The user story must be estimated. I'm embarrassed to say this, but unfortunately most definition of readies will contain a line saying a user story must have acceptance criteria. To me, you cannot have a user story without acceptance criteria, but unfortunately I find in so many organizations that they have user stories without acceptance criteria. So most of the definition of ready, when we create them, definition of ready generally contains a line which says that user stories must be estimated, user stories must follow the 3 C's principle, and user stories must follow the invest model. What is 3 C's? The first C stands for card. The second C is conversation, and the third is confirmation. So what generally it means is that firstly, in olden days, before Jira, when I started being Scrum Master, in those days we used to have physical sprint boards, and we had our user stories written on these index cards. So what it used to be is that in front of our one side of the index card, we would have, as a user, I want this so, on a user story, and on the back of it was the acceptance criteria. So user story by definition is not a requirement document. User story is a card, it's a placeholder for a conversation with the business stakeholders. It is conversation with your end users of what they want. And based on that, we have acceptance criteria, confirmation. So card, conversation, and confirmation. That is what 3 C's stand for. What does invest stand for? In invest, I stands for independent. We want our user stories to be independent. There should be something that we can work on independently. They should not be dependent on other user stories. All of the requirements and all of the aspect needed to deliver that user story must be part of the user story. For instance, building a UI interface, doing the database change, writing the back-end code, they should be part of the user story. That user story should be front, back, and everything that is required to deliver that little set of functionality or a feature. So user story, ideally we want them to be independent. Unfortunately, because of technical reasons, some user stories are not independent, but they should not be the norm. They should be the outliers. N in a user story stands for negotiable. User stories are placeholder for conversations, so they are not a contract. So we should want to have a conversation. We want to negotiate with our stakeholders what that user story means. We want to have that conversation of what is the best way to deliver that. So in invest, the N stands for negotiable. We want those stories to be negotiable. We don't want them to be a contract. V in invest stands for value. Every user story that we deliver should contain a value. What we find these days is that 60% of the features delivered in apps, in software, are generally not used. So what a waste of money, effort and energy by the teams building these features that are never used. So let's make sure that when we are about to deliver any user story, that we can explain the value it will deliver to our end users. And if we cannot explain the value, then what's the point of delivering it? Then let's scrap that user story and try to focus on the user stories that will be delivered, that will deliver value to our end users and make that application small but robust as well. And that brings benefits to our users. E in invest stands for estimatable. So every user story, we should be able to estimate that. We should know how much work is contained to deliver that. Most teams will estimate in story points, but even if you are using something like #NoEstimate, still we want to make sure that when we are about to commit to that user story in our sprint, we can explain how much work is required to deliver that user story. So it's not that it's an endless piece of work. It should have a scope, and we should understand the scope of what is required to deliver this user story. So we want that to be estimatable. S in invest stands for small or size small. We want our user stories to be small as possible and deliver infrequently. The user stories should take hours to deliver, not days. So try to make them as small as possible. And we should want to limit the functionality we want to deliver in a user story, only the minimum that is required for that user story to be successful. T in invest stands for testable. Every user story should be able to be tested. We should know how we're going to test that. And when we are estimating any user story, we should include the effort required to test that user story. So we want to make sure that when we deliver this user story, it's fully trusted, it is fully robust. So T in invest stands for testable. There is a really good book on writing user stories. You can see it here on the screen, the image of it. I'm going to share the link to it below in the description. It's one of the best books on writing user stories, and I recommend all product owners to read that. And it covers that invest model inside it. Now that we have covered what invest is, what 3 C's is, and what definition of ready normally contains, let's talk about how you would go about creating a definition of ready. Firstly, definition of ready is a process, it's a joint effort by everyone within your Scrum team. So book a meeting where everyone from your Scrum team is going to be present. My recommendation is that upfront send them some documentation about what invest model is, what 3 C's is that they have read up on, and what definition of ready is. Then when everyone is there present in your definition of ready creation meeting, what I recommend is you spend the first 10 minutes talking about what definition of ready is, the purpose of it, the benefits of it, and then quickly cover the invest model and the 3 C's. Then what you want to do is sit with the team and make notes. In a physical meeting, I recommend that you get them to write on post-it notes of the things that stop them from delivering a user story or if you are using a virtual meeting, then Miro or something, a virtual whiteboard application you can use, and make a list of all of the things that have blocked the team during a sprint from delivering that user story. And then in definition of ready, write down what could have been done to prevent that. So it could have been something like dependencies were not defined up front. Then you would write down that you are aware of what dependencies are when we are bringing user stories into sprint. We want to make sure that we discuss all of the blockers that got blocked. It could be things like there were always changing requirements, but make sure that you sit with the team and as a team you agree on the thing that you can do up front to stop this team from being blocked during the sprint. And make sure that is your definition of ready. When you got all of those blockers for you, specifically for your team, written down and things that you are going to abide by, then on top of that add the invest model and 3 C's there and say, okay, so we have covered that we are going to define dependencies, but we want to make sure that our user stories contain estimates. So go through the invest model and 3 C's and put anything missing from there onto your definition of ready. But make sure the things that have been blocking your team, they are first covered within your definition of ready. And if you got those, then that will help and benefit your team. That will encourage them to follow the definition of ready. They'll see the benefit. But if you create a definition of ready based on invest model and 3 C's and not cover the pain points that your team is facing, then you won't get the benefit of definition of ready. Also, definition of ready should not be the final document. I would say agree with the team that in 6 months' time you will review your definition of ready, you'll review your definition of done, and there should be incremental processes as your team evolves, as they become better, get them to change the processes, how they work and how they do things. Please let me know if you have created definition of ready for your teams and the benefit they have brought for your teams in the comments below. And if you have liked this video or if you found any information from this video beneficial, then please press thumbs up and subscribe. Thank you for watching.